On the second night of the Black Fork flood, the south wind ran at 52 miles an hour, and the creek rose 8 feet in 2 hours. 3 inches of rain. The cold fell from 79 degrees to 46, and a body could not see its own hands. The center anchor tore loose. The wagon listed toward the draw. Mara Venn tied a rope around her waist and put the free end in Ross Calder's hands. If it went, it took the food, the ledger, and both children. Cora slept in a cot slung above the tilting floor. Eli called the watermarks up through the wind. Jude Tanner, who had laughed at the guide rope, held its lantern with a broken wrist. Tomas turned 3,000 head from the bank. Then the second anchor began to move. 49 days earlier, a 20-year-old widow had walked up to Blackwater Fold, asking only for food and a place beneath the wagon fly. How did she come to stand between Ross Calder's herd and ruin? Late on April 10th, 1879, Mara Venn walked the last mile to Blackwater Fold because the wagon that had carried her that far refused to go another rod. Ruth Penroe had hauled them to the fork in the freight road and no farther. Ruth ran meal and salt between the Texas settlements, and she worked with 2 harness nails held between her lips, so that most of what she said came out around iron. It came out around iron now. "My contract runs east," Ruth said. "Yours runs north. That's the fork, and I'm sorry for it." Mara did not argue. A person who hauled you 11 miles for nothing was owed thanks, not persuasion. She lifted Cora down first. The child was 2 years old and warm at the neck with a cough that had ridden with them since the last cold camp, and she held a cloth rabbit missing one ear and twisted the ear that was left. Then Mara reached up for Eli. He was 9, and he came down with one hand pressed flat to the front of his coat over the place where he kept half a biscuit that he thought no one knew about. He kept it there every day. He counted his meals by how many were left, not by what day was coming. Mara set her tool roll on the ground and laid a hand on the rear hub of Ruth's wagon out of habit and tapped it twice, and felt the heat that meant a long haul and no grease to spare. There were flour burns healed pale along her left wrist, and old axle grease worked so deep beneath one thumbnail it would not come out for anything. Her husband had put that grease there. Thomas Venn had been a wheelwright, and he had taught her to read a wheel by watching the first 6 feet of its track and to hear a dry hub before it caught. And he had died in the winter of lung fever after a night's work in freezing rain that could not wait. She did not count the months since. She counted the flour, which was down to enough for one more meal. The tool roll was bound with a wide strap of harness leather stamped with a small maker's mark, 2 letters, T and V. Eli looked at the strap while she settled it on her shoulder. He did not touch it. 3 homesteads had turned them from the door already that spring, kindly and firmly, the way people turn away what they cannot feed. At the last one, a woman had pressed 2 cold potatoes into Eli's hands through a half-open door and shut it before he could thank her, and the boy had carried the potatoes 3 days before he would eat them. Mara had stopped asking at doors. The last mile went uphill through short grass, Cora on her hip, and the tool roll dragging her other shoulder down, and the child coughed against her collar the whole way. Ahead, across the low ground, a chuck wagon came up out of a draw behind a 6-mule team, and even at that distance she saw it lean. It rode down on the left rear and dragged its shadow crooked, and something in her that had gone quiet for a year took a small professional interest. She shifted Cora higher and started toward it. The man driving was Ross Calder, and Blackwater Fold was his, and by the 3rd week of that spring he had already cut and thrown out 40 head of scrub too poor to trail. He held the near rein rolled once around his left hand, which was habit and not nerve, And when the strangers came up out of the grass, he stopped the team but did not get down. "Nothing here to buy," Ross said, "and nothing to sell." "I'm not selling," Mara said. "I'm not buying." "Then you're lost." "No." She set Cora on her feet in the grass and kept a hand on the small shoulder. "Your left rear hub's run dry. It'll sing before Tuesday and seize before the week's out, and you'll lose the wheel on a downgrade with the whole load coming after it." She did not raise her voice. "Your water casks ride behind the axle where they've no business, and your flowers stowed low on the near side where the road splash comes up through the boards, so you're feeding your men wet flour and calling it luck when nobody sickens. Your brake shoe bites hard on one side and slick on the other, and whoever cooks off that wagon has to turn his back on his own fire to open the coffee chest, which is how a man scalds a hand in the dark and rides the next day useless." Ross looked at her a while. A swing rider had drifted in to listen, a young man of 24 named Jude Tanner, who slapped the dust off his hat against his knee before he spoke, and he slapped it now. "Are we driving cattle," Jude said, "or opening a boarding house?" Ross did not answer him. He got down. He walked to the left rear wheel, laid the back of 2 fingers against the hub, took them away, and said nothing, which was its own answer. Then, because he trusted no claim he had not seen worked, he chalked the front wheels and told Jude to throw the brake, and the two of them watched the near shoe bite hard into the tire, while the off shoe skated across it and held nothing. He worked the lever twice more to be sure. He did not say she was right about that either. He unchalked the wheels. "Feed the children," Mara said. "Give us room beneath the wagon fly. Pay me only after your men have eaten 30 days without losing one to bad water or spoiled stores." She let that stand. "I cook. I keep the wagon. I keep the stores dry and the sick mending, and I keep a book of every pound that goes in and every pound that spoils, so you know a shortage before it hurts you. I ask no wage until it holds." "You found 5 things wrong with my wagon from the grass," Ross said. "I did." "You missed the one most likely to kill a man." He said it flat, without heat, and did not tell her which. He looked at the load a moment, at how high and how far back it rode, and then he looked at the children instead. "Eat first," he said. "We'll talk about the rest after." He took a tin plate off the wagon and filled it before he asked her one more question, and set it in front of Eli. And when the boy did not reach for it, Ross set it closer and turned away so the reaching would not be watched. The boy ate half and slid the other half toward his coat before he caught himself. Ross had walked off already and did not see it, or did not let himself be seen seeing it. Then he took a second cup down from the chuck box and set it at the place by the fire where Mara would sit, and did it without a word, the way a man does a thing he has not done in a long while and does not care to discuss. The next morning a man came out from town on a gray horse with a satchel of the lender's paper, and the whole shape of the 86 days ahead came with him. His name was Abel Mercer, 57 years old, an army wagon master in his time and now the tallyman who counted for the men Ross owed. He wiped every tool and every blade on his sleeve before he handed it back, even a borrowed pencil. He wiped the pencil now and read from the paper without softening any of it. Ross owed $6,400 against a note that came due the 1st of August. The North Pasture stood as security, and the remuda was pledged separately against the crew's wages, so a bad delivery did not cost him one thing. It cost him 3: the ground, the horses, and the men. He had to put 3,040 head on the trail and bring at least 2,880 into Dodge City in sound, saleable condition. Losses past 160 broke the note. The sale opened July 13th. The rail cars were promised the 15th. Abel folded the paper and looked at the cook wagon and at the young widow standing beside it. "I've counted 100 outfits into Kansas," he said. I never counted one saved by a tidy pantry. You don't believe the wagon matters, Mara said. I don't believe your system will survive the trail. You should not, Mara said. Not until it does. Abel wiped the pencil once more and put it away. He spread the map on the tailgate and set a blunt finger on the string of water holes between there and the red, and named the gallons each would give a herd this size in a dry April, and did the arithmetic aloud. The herd as gathered was 40 head too heavy for that water. Somewhere in the first 3 weeks, 40 head would have to drink from a hole that was not on his map, or 40 head would die of the plan itself. Ross looked at the string of holes a long moment and said he would not cut 40 good steers to save himself the trouble of finding water. Abel folded the map, said that was his to answer for, mounted the gray, and rode back the way he had come, and left the number sitting in the camp like a stone. She cooked for them that evening, and that was the first thing they judged her by that counted. She did not touch the fire the last cook had left. She raked it down, banked it narrow so the heat stood in one place instead of blowing off in 3, and set the ovens where the coals could be read instead of guessed at. Before she cooked a bite, she turned the chuck box on its hinges so the coffee and the cup stood to the side of the fire and not behind it, and a cook reaching for a cup in the dark never had to put his back to his own coals again. It was the 5th thing she had named from the grass and the easiest to cure, and she cured it first. Then she fed the starter she carried in a small crock wrapped in wool, a living thing her father had kept before her, and she had kept 11 years, and by the time the men came in, there were biscuits off it, risen and brown, which is a thing a hungry man remembers about a cook longer than he remembers her name. She timed the whole meal against the work. The men came off the herd in 2 shifts and ate hot and went back, and the herd was never once left thin of riders to do it. 14 grown men and 2 children ate off that one fire, and no watch went unmanned. The water was the trouble. The hole they had bedded near was fouled, churned to a brown soup by the last outfit's stock, and one of Ross's hands had been griping in the gut 2 days from drinking it straight. Mara drew the worst of it into a barrel and let it stand while she worked, so the heavy dirt could fall to the bottom, and she boiled what she meant to cook and cool for drinking. To the griping man she gave boiled water with a little salt and a little molasses and nothing else, and told him to take it slow, a swallow at a time. It was not a cure. It was the difference between a man in the saddle and a man over the side of it, and by morning he was in the saddle. The Liad Vaquero watched all of it without a word. His name was Tomas Ruiz, 31, and he ran the point and read the herd's temper the way Mara read a wheel, and he had a habit of drawing a rope's end between his lips to feel for the fray a thumb would miss. He drew a rope through his lips now, watching her bank the fire, and when she had finished he said only, "The last man cooked when the beans were done. You cook when the men are hungry. That is not the same thing." From Tomas it was a long speech. Jude, who had eaten 2 plates and meant to say nothing kind about any of it, said nothing at all, which for Jude was progress. Ross ate last, standing, and set his plate down clean. 30 days, he said. You've one behind you. That was the whole of it. They should have rolled at first light, and they did not. When Mara laid the back of her hand to the off-front hub before the wheels turned, it was too hot to hold, a hub she had never named, packed wrong by a man who no longer worked there. Thomas had checked every hub at first light, whether the wagon had moved or not, and now she understood in her own hands why. There was always another hub. The wagon did not roll until she had drawn the wheel, cleaned the spindle, and packed it right, and that cost them the morning and went into the book under lost, with the cause named plainly. So she rebuilt the wagon, and she rebuilt it in an order, and the order was the whole of her argument. The wagon came first because a wagon on its side fed no one and dried nothing. The stores came second because wet flour and fouled water could lose a herd as surely as a river could, only slower. The book came third because a thing you cannot count, you cannot defend. She said as much to Ross, plainly, and he did not argue the order, which was how she knew he had thought it through the same way from the other end. She wet the wheel tracks with a dipper and walked him out to look before she moved a thing. The left rear rut cut 3 fingers deeper than the right. The load rode heavy and high and to the rear, and that, she understood now, was the thing he had meant on the first day. A wagon loaded like that gave no warning. It simply went over on the first side hill or the first ford, and it went over onto whoever walked the low side to steady it. She did not tell him he had been right. She fixed it, which said the same thing. She moved the water 6 inches forward of the rear axle line and lashed it new so it could not shift. She hung the Dutch ovens beneath the chuck box, out of the way and low, so their weight rode near the ground. She split the 2 big flour sacks into 4 smaller ones a woman could lift one-handed and stowed them high enough that no man had to bend into the road splash to reach the day's ration. She carried the spare iron off the rear chest and set it in the tongue box up front, where the tongue could carry it, and the tail of the wagon would stop swinging behind the team like a dog on a slack lead. A 17-year-old wrangler named Noah Cade helped her lift the iron. He counted the horses by tapping his boot heel against the ground, 1 tap ahead, and he was trailing north for his first full wage, which he meant to carry home to his mother, and he watched everything Mara did as though he might be asked to do it himself one day. He would be. Then she built the dry floor. She laid a false floor of slats 3 inches above the wagon boards, with 1/2-inch gaps between them so air could move under the stores, and she hung an oilcloth skirt along the wagon sides that ended 4 inches below the bed and left the corners open so any water that got in could get back out instead of standing. She sewed the skirt by hand, driving the needle through the doubled oilcloth with a wetting thimble she carried in the small tin inside her kit, and she did not say whose wetting, and no one asked. To prove it, she poured a full dipper hard against the near wheel, the way the road throws mud, and had Eli crawl under and lay his hand flat on the bottoms of the flour sacks. "Wet or dry?" she said. "Dry," Eli said from under the wagon. "All 4, dry." One of the older hands who had watched the whole business with his arms folded came over then and put his own hand under the wagon and felt the sacks himself, and took his hand back and folded his arms again and still said nothing, but he did not sneer any more, and that too was a kind of ledger entry. Last she started the book. She ruled the columns off the headings from an old round-up ledger Ross handed her, without saying where he had kept it. Received, issued, spoiled, lost, recovered, remaining, cause, corrected. She measured the coffee into the first line with a brass measure notched at 12 cups, and she gave the boy the making of the marks. "Every pound in, every pound gone, and the reason for it," she told Eli. "You keep it. At the end of the day, you read the total out loud, so we both hear the same number." She handed him the marked stick as well. "And every hub, first thing, before the wheels turn, you measure the sink. No rut deeper than 1 finger past the other. If it's more, you tell me before I mount the seat, not after." She put the stick in his hand. "You're the judge of it." Eli pressed his thumbnail into the wood the way he pressed it into a tally mark, to be sure it was real. That night, he read the day's total out loud in a voice that shook only a little, and no one laughed, and he read it steadier the next night. Ross drove the rebuilt wagon over a sloped stretch of pasture to prove the balance, with Mara walking the low wheels. At the bottom turn, the whole load leaned to the outside and hung there a long half-second on 2 wheels before it came down flat. Better than 3 fingers. not yet right. She shifted the water another hand's breadth forward and had him run it again, and the second time it held its feet through the turn, and the two of them stood looking at the wagon in the last light without saying anything, which was the first easy silence between them. The rival came the day before they were to move the herd out. Mace Redden ran the outfit north of Ross's line, twice the size, and he had offered Ross $4,000 for the north pasture 2 winters running, and been refused both times. The pasture held the only live water for 8 miles in a dry year. Whoever owned it owned the corridor, and Mace meant to own the corridor. He was 41, and he trimmed his thumbnail with a small knife while other men talked, which he was doing when he walked the length of the rebuilt cook wagon and looked at the dry floor slats and the 4 small flour sacks and the labeled water casks. "A petticoat pantry," Mace said, and closed the little knife. "You'll lose half a day every time she stops to strain her water and dry her sacks, Ross. You'll deliver late, if you deliver at all, and I'll still be standing here when the note comes due." He had promised Ross the loan of a spare mule team for the steep bank at the North Crossing. He unpromised it standing there, easy as trimming a nail. "I find I'll want my mules for my own drive. You understand how it is." It cost Ross that same afternoon. 2,000 pounds that the spare team was to have carried up the bank had to go up on men's backs instead, load by load, into the failing light, and it cost the outfit 6 hours it did not have to spare. Halfway up, a sack slid on one of the hands and took him sideways toward the drop, and it was Tomas who got a shoulder under the load, and Noah who caught the man's belt, and for one breath the 3 of them hung on the lip of the bank, with 2,000 pounds deciding which way to fall. It fell back. Nobody spoke of how close it had been. Mara carried her share until a wet rope pulled through her left palm and split it open along the heel of the hand. She wrapped it in a strip of clean cloth and carried more. Ross took off his gloves and gave them to her without a word, and worked the rest of the bank bare-handed. And when she looked at his knuckles later, split and bleeding at 2 joints, he had already turned to the next load. Neither of them said one thing about the gloves. Ruth Penroe was still on the ground, having stayed to see the strangers settled, and she watched the mules leave and did the sum before Ross did. She held a harness nail between her lips and spoke around it. "I've a team," Ruth said. "You can have it for the crossing, but I'll not lend it for thanks. I buried a husband who lent things for thanks. I'll take a written share of your completion premium. Small, fair, signed." Ross could take her terms or lose a day he did not have. He signed, and the 6 lost hours and Ruth's future share both went into the book, and the loss he could afford before the note broke got smaller by the size of them. The last thing Mara built before they trailed out was the fire, and it was the first thing she built wrong. She cut a trench 1.5 feet deep and 4 feet long, banked a sod wall 20 inches high along the windward edge, and wrapped it on 3 sides with canvas stretched over green hide, tight as a drumhead, so no wind could reach the coals and rob the heat she needed. She had lost fires to wind before, whole mornings of wet men and cold coffee, and she had closed the shield tighter against it than she ever had. She was thinking about the heat. She was not thinking about the smoke, which needs somewhere to go as much as a fire needs somewhere to burn. Ross watched her set the last of the sod, then walked out 30 paces to where the herd would bed for the night, stood a moment with his back to her, and came back. "Turn it," Ross said, "a third of the way round. It's clear of the wagon." "It's not clear of the herd. The evening wind runs out of the southwest along this ground. You've aimed your smoke straight into the bed. 1,000 head can smell a strange fire, and a herd that can't sleep is a herd that runs, and a herd that runs at night takes a man down under it." He said it the way he had said the hub, without heat. "I don't tell you your flour. Don't tell me my cattle." She turned the trench a third of the way round without defending it. It was his ground, the way the wheel was hers. While the sod dried, Ross went to the wagon and unlocked a small drawer he kept locked, and took out the brass coffee measure gone dark with handling, with the notch filed into the rim that marked the exact scoop for 12 cups, and set it in the chuck box among the coffee, and did not say whose it had been. He did not have to. Lenora Calder had kept the accounts at Blackwater Fold, and kept a sourdough starter alive through wet roundup camps when other cooks lost theirs, and she had set out 2 cups by the fire before dawn, whether Ross was awake to drink from one or not, and she had been 3 winters gone of the pneumonia. The ledger headings Eli now made his marks beneath were ruled in her hand. Ross Calder kept what the dead had touched, and he did not talk about it. Then he lifted down a thing that had hung in the ranch work shed all that spring, a small chair of ashwood not yet finished, the seat still open to the frame, and carried it out and stowed it among the gear in the wagon rather than leave it behind, and did not explain that either. Eli looked at the unfinished chair a long time. He did not touch it. That evening, when the breeze came up, Mara tied 3 strips of cloth to a stick at 3 heights above the turned trench, the way she tested every draft. The 2 upper strips streamed away clean. The lowest strip, down near the coals, lay over and pointed back at her chest. The low air was not leaving. It was rolling back under the tight shield and creeping out along the ground. She stood over it a while in the dusk and could not name what was wrong, only that something was. They trailed out on the 17th. The wagon rode the way a wagon should, quiet behind the team, and on the 3rd day it took a long side hill above a wash without so much as leaning, and Mara felt the difference through her boots and said nothing, and Ross, driving, said nothing either. Eli read the totals out every night. On the 6th day the labeled casks and the boiled water carried them past a hole so poor Abel would have written it off, and they lost no head there, which was the beginning of an answer to his number, though not yet the whole of one. The low cloth strip still lay over toward the coals every evening, and every evening Mara looked at it and could not spend the time to learn it, because there was always the next hole, and the next meal, and the next hub. So the trench went on being wrong, quietly, in fair weather, waiting. The squall came on the 12th day out, on the far edge of a warm afternoon. The first drops came fat and far apart, and then all at once the light went the color of a bruise, and the temperature fell so fast the sweat turned cold on a man's back between one breath and the next. A wall of slate-gray, dragging cold rain struck the camp and blew through it in 43 minutes flat. Mara's rebuilt wagon took it standing level. The dry floor held the flour off the wet boards. The rain skirt shed its water into the open drain corners, and the sacks stayed damp, 2 fingers up the outside and dry as August underneath. Eli crouched at the wheel with his stick and called it out in the first whole sentence he had spoken since the road. The left sack is wet 2 fingers up, but the flour inside is dry. An observation, not a feeling. The coal cradle held heat enough beneath the ovens to keep coffee hot for men coming in soaked to the collar, and Mara had Cora's cot moved in under the driest part of the fly with a blanket over the child before the worst of it hit. But the wind drove down over the tight shield and found the low draft, and the smoke that should have climbed rolled out under the sod wall instead and lay down and crawled along the ground straight into the bed, exactly the way the lowest cloth strip had warned. The lead cattle got to their feet. They stood into the wind with their heads up and their ears working, and then they began to press, shifting the whole herd tight against the far riders, and a sound went through them low and building that Thomas heard before he saw it. Across the draw, on the opposite ridge, 2 of Mace Redden's outriders sat their horses in the rain and watched it happen, and did not offer to help, and would carry back what they had seen. Ross was already moving. The rein rolled once round his left hand, calling Tomas and 2 more onto the pressing flank. turning the riders into the drift before the herd could turn itself. For a long half-minute it hung there, the cattle pushing and the men pushing back, the rain coming sideways off the brims of their hats. Then the smoke thinned as the fire guttered, and the pressure went out of the herd, and the cattle settled and stood streaming in the wet, and no man had gone down under them. Ross came off the flank soaked through and did not look at the wagon or the dry flour or the book. He looked at the trench and at the last of the smoke lying flat along the ground, and then at Mara, and he did not say what he was thinking, and he did not have to. When it was over, Mara knelt at the trench in the mud and looked at the 3 strips of cloth. The 2 high strips hung dead. The low strip still pointed at her chest. She had built a wall the wind could not get into, and sealed the smoke in behind it with the coals. "We built it wrong," Mara said. By first light, Mara had the shield off the trench. The green hide peeled back and folded. The canvas rolled and lashed, and she did not say one word in its defense while she did it. Ross came over with his coffee, stood watching a while, then set the cup down in the grass to go cold and knelt to help. The wrong of it was plain once the shield was gone. She had built a wall the wind could not get into, 3 sides tight to the ground, and she had left the smoke no road out but down. Cold air came over the top of the sod and rolled to the bottom of the trench and pushed the smoke ahead of it, out under the wall and along the earth, straight into the herd. She had fought the wind and forgotten the smoke. "I made a box for the wind," Mara said. "I made one for the smoke, too." They rebuilt it lower and looser, and it cost them the better part of a morning to do, which she wrote in the book without excuse. She cut the sod wall down at the far end so the low air had a lip to climb and spill over, and she opened a gap a hand wide along the sheltered side, down near the coals, so the draft that wanted to lie on the ground had somewhere to go besides the bed. Ross carried the last of the cut sod without being asked and set it where she pointed and not where he thought it should go, which was its own kind of concession. Then he walked out to the bedding place while she lit it, and stood where a steer's nose would be, hat off, and watched, because that was the part he knew, and she did not. The first smoke came up gray, lifted, thinned above head height, and went off clean on the wind. He came back and said it was better. He did not say good, and she did not ask him to. She tied her 3 strips of cloth to the stick again, and set them over the trench in the evening breeze. The 2 high strips streamed away. The low strip, the one that had lain over and pointed at her all those days, lifted, hung a moment, and streamed away after the others. All 3 pointed the same road now, and the road ran away from the cattle. Eli watched the low strip lift and made a mark in his book under corrected and pressed his thumbnail into it, hard, the way he did to be sure of a thing. That night a smell came off the wagon that a cook knows the way a wheelwright knows a dry hub. Sour. Wrong. It came from the reserve crock. Mara had done what her father taught, which was never to trust one crock. She had split the starter she carried. The working part kept close in its wool, and a reserve poured off into a second crock, a handsome glazed thing she had taken in trade for a day's mending at the last settlement, wrapped tight and stowed against the day the working crock broke. Now the reserve was the one that had broken, not a cross. A hairline, fine as a hair, run down the glaze from the lip, and the sour starter weeping through it into the wool a drop at a time. She brought the lantern close and turned the crock in the light until she found the line, thin and bright and almost pretty. Then she wiped the crock dry and stood it on a scoop of loose flour and waited. In a little while the flour beneath went dark and damp. The crock had looked sound the day she took it. It had never been sound. Glaze hides a crack the way still water hides a snag. The crock was pretty, Mara said. It was not sound. She had starter enough in the working crock to raise bread for a while yet, but she had no reserve now, and a cook on a trail with no reserve is one spilled crock away from feeding her men flat bread and apologies the rest of the way to Kansas. She wrote it into the book under Lost, and under Cause she wrote, chose it for the look of it, because a fault named plainly is a fault that does not repeat. Ross had gone still, the way he went still around anything of the dead. Then he crossed to the wagon and took down a wooden box Mara had not seen him open, a recipe box with a woman's careful hand on the cards inside, the ink browned, but the letters square and sure. He turned through them without reading them aloud until he found what he wanted, a folded packet of waxed cloth gone stiff and dark with the years, and he held it in his two hands a moment before he put it in hers. Lenora carried her reserve like this, Ross said, not wet in a crock, stiff, dried hard, folded in the waxed cloth, shut in a tin with the lid down. She used to say a wet thing wants to leak and a dry thing only wants feeding when its time comes. She brought a whole camp through 2 soaking roundups on it the year the other outfits were eating hardtack. He let go of the packet. The method's sound. She isn't here to work it. You are. Mara worked a stiff dough off the last of her living starter, dried it hard by the low fire, folded it into a fresh square of waxed cloth, and shut it in a lidded coffee tin where no crack could weep and no wet could reach. 2 reserves now, made 2 ways so that no single failure could take them both. Before he shut the recipe box, Ross turned it so the top card faced her, a bread receipt in the brown square hand, and at the foot of it, in the same hand, a line that was no part of any receipt. Keep 2, always. 1 you can see, and 1 you can't. Mara read it and said nothing, and Ross shut the box, and she understood that the method he had put in her hands had been put in his first, and that she was only the third to keep it. She did not say thank you for the packet. She used it, which said the same thing, and Ross seemed to take it as it was meant. The next fix she could hold in her 2 hands, and it fought her less than the fire had. She built a coal cradle for the ovens, a shallow iron tray that held the coals a fixed span beneath the pot, so the heat came off them even and known instead of guessed at, with a rail bent round to keep the lid coals from sliding and to turn the rain that ran off the fly so it could not run into the food. And she began a second, smaller book beside the first, a coal table. So many coals under and so many on the lid for biscuits, fewer for beans, a longer count for stew, each with the time it wanted written in her hand so the fire could be built to a number and not to a feeling. The tallyman came out from the settlements while she was ruling it. Abel Mercer rode up on the gray, wiped his pencil on his sleeve, and looked at the coal table a long moment and did not laugh at it, which was the first thing that told her he might be worth answering. Then he asked hard questions, the kind a friend asks and an enemy never bothers to, and every one of them changed something. Who knows this count besides you? Abel said. No one yet. Then it dies the first night you're pulled off the fire to sew up a rider, and your men go cold in the one weather they can least afford it. He wiped the pencil. Teach it to a second hand before you sleep. She taught it that evening to Noah Cade, 17 and trailing north for his first full wage, who counted the horses by tapping his boot heel and now learned to count coals the same way, 1 tap a coal until he could build a biscuit fire blind and prove it by the biscuit. Where do you keep your bandages? Abel said. Under the flour. So a man bleeds while you dig past 100 pounds of flour to find them, and the flour takes the rain while you do it. He wiped the pencil. 2 failures waiting on 1 careless minute. Move it. She built the medical roll that same afternoon, up out from under the food where it had no business being, bandages in a lidded tin, needle and gut thread in a smaller box inside it, splints lashed flat beneath the wagon seat where a hand could find them by feel in the dark. One kettle set aside for water and wounds and nothing else, so nothing that touched a fever touched the food, and the medicine written into the book after every use, so she would know what she had before she needed it and not after. A man could be sewn now without a sack of flour being open to the weather to reach the thread. "What keeps the wet from standing under that oilcloth skirt?" Abel said, and stooped to look along the lower edge. "The corners are left open. It drains." "It drains where the ground's flat. Where it isn't, that low edge holds a puddle against your boards all night." He wiped the pencil. "Cut a weep every foot along the bottom hem." She cut the weep holes that evening, a small slit every 12 inches along the hem, and the skirt shed clean after, even where the ground dipped. It was a fault that had not yet cost her anything, which was the only kind Abel took any pleasure in finding. A traveling physician came through that same week, riding the long road between the supply posts. A spare, gray-whiskered man named Elias Wren, who folded his spectacles into the same breast pocket after every look he took, as though the pocket were the last step of every examination. Mara's left palm, split open on the bank the day Mace pulled his mules, had gone hot and tight and red along the seam. Wren opened it, drew off the bad matter, and bound it clean, and while he worked, he took the measure of her kettle and her separate water and her boiled cloths, and said he had seen worse practice in a paid town infirmary. He said it where Abel could hear, which was worth more to her than the doctoring. Then he folded his spectacles into his pocket and rode on north, and said he might pass their way again before the trail was through, which he would. Before he went, he asked whether they had heard what the rivers were doing to the south, and when Ross said they had not, Wren looked at the sky a moment and said only that he had crossed 3 creeks running higher than the season had any right to, and had not liked the color of one of them. Then he folded his spectacles away and rode on. She had not finished writing the coal table when the second test came, and it came as cold rain. On the 20th of May, a slow gray rain set in and stayed 11 hours, cold enough to sting the back of the neck, the kind of steady wet that finds a wagon's every weakness and works at it. The dry floor held. Every sack of flour stayed dry to the last one. The men burned 5 bundles of firewood where the old way would have burned 7, because the trench and the cradle kept the heat where it was made, instead of letting the wind and the wet steal it. Water loss stayed under a single marked bucket the whole day. Not one man missed a watch. It was the best the outfit had ever run in bad weather, and every number of it went into the book. The men came in off the watches in their turns, streaming, drank the hot coffee standing under the fly, and went back out into it, and the ones off watch slept dry under the raised floor's overhang for the first wet night any of them could remember, and said so in the morning. And Mara nearly ruined the meal off the middle of it. The rain made the fire look starved. The flames lay flat and hissed and threw no color at all, and a cook's whole body says feed it when a fire looks like that. So she fed it, coals under and coals on the lid, more than the table called for, sure the rain was robbing her heat. She pulled the first oven, and the biscuit bottoms had gone black as the burned trench, while the tops sat pale and raw. She broke 3 of them in half, and laid the 6 pieces in a row, and looked at the layers, black to gold to raw, bottom to top, the whole story of her mistake set out in a biscuit. "The oven did what I told it," Mara said. "I told it wrong." The fire had looked weak because rain steals a fire's color and not its heat. The coals under the cradle had been right all along. She had read the sky instead of reading the count, and the count was the whole reason she had spent 3 evenings writing the count. Ross had come in for coffee and seen the row of split biscuits. He did not scold her, and he did not spare her either. He looked at the black bottoms a while. "You promised to fix it," Ross said. "You never promised to guess right the first time." She fixed it the only way a count can be fixed, which was to trust the count and let the flame lie all it pleased. From then the coals went under by number and by the turn of the little sand glass, and the look of the fire was given no vote. Noah, who had learned the count blind and was never once tempted to feed a fire he could not see, took the ovens for the rest of the rain and brought every pan up gold. He said nothing about being trusted with them. Mara said nothing either, but she let him keep them, which said it. It cost them half a day of the schedule, rebuilding the habit and drilling Noah on it, and Abel wrote that cost in his book too. Abel had stood at the edge of the whole 11 hours with his collar turned up, wiping the rain off his pencil, saying nothing. When it broke, he read her book front to back, the good numbers and the black biscuits together, and gave his verdict flat. "It worked 11 hours, Abel said. "That is not the same as working when the ground moves under you. You'll want more wood than you think you'll want, and a man awake at that fire every hour of the worst of it, not most of them." He wiped the pencil and put it away in his coat. "But it worked 11 hours. I've counted outfits that never managed the one." Something turned in the boy that week that no one spoke of, because to speak of it would have turned it back. Eli had hoarded from the first day on the road half a biscuit into the coat every morning, one hand sleeping over the pocket like a dog over a bone. Mara had watched it and said nothing, and had taken to setting an extra half beside his plate now and then, as though the count had simply come out odd, and let him eat it or pocket it as he pleased, and never once looked to see which. The morning after the cold rain, she came to the wagon and found 3 saved biscuit halves set out on the shelf by the flour, dry and going hard, left in the open where any hand could take them. He had stopped carrying tomorrow around in his coat. Nobody said a word about the biscuits. Mara folded them into the day's ration and wrote them into the book under received, and left off the part that said from Eli where the boy might read it. That same dawn, cold and not yet light, Ross set 2 cups down by the fire. He had set one every morning of the trail for himself. This time he set 2, the second at the place where Mara took her coffee, and he did it the way he had done it once for a wife who used to do it for him, without turning to see whether it was noticed. Mara noticed. She drank from the second cup and washed them both after and stood them upside down to dry side by side, and said nothing, and neither did he. Cora took to reaching for the cuff of Ross's coat when he passed the fly, and holding it a moment, and letting go. He let her, and slowed his step to let her reach it, and that was all. That night, Ross sat mending a hackamore by the low fire, and Mara sat across from him mending a tear in the fly, driving the needle with the bent thimble, and for a long while neither of them said much, which was its own kind of company. Thomas kept a horseshoe nail in his hatband, Mara said, not looking up from the cloth. "Every day of the 11 years I knew him. Said a man's never more than 1 nail short of useless." She bit the thread. "I don't know what became of the hat." Ross worked the hackamore a moment. "Lenora hummed at the bread," he said. "Same 3 notes over and over, no tune to them. I used to think it would drive me clean out of my head." He set the hackamore down across his knee. "House has been quiet since." That was the whole of it. They went back to the mending. The unfinished chair rode in the wagon among the gear, where Eli had to see it every time he climbed in for the book. He looked at it longer now. He still did not put a hand to it. Tomas came in off the point that evening, drawing a rope's end through his lips, and the news he brought was about water. The next good hole, 2 days on, had a big outfit on it already, watering slow and fouling it behind them, and what they left would be brown soup by the time Blackwater Fold's herd came down to it. So she built the water system before they reached it, because a herd cannot wait at a fouled hole and a herd cannot drink mud. 2 casks now, and a rule laid between them. Raw water went into the first cask to stand, so the heavy dirt could fall to the bottom on its own. From there, it passed through a boiled cloth into the clean cask, and the dipper that touched the clean cask touched nothing else, ever. And the issue bucket had ration marks carved down the inside, so a thirsty man in a hurry could not take tomorrow's water today. It was sound in every part but one. She had boiled the filter cloth and wrung it and folded it double and packed it into the neck of the cask as tight as a cork, meaning to catch every last speck of grit, and it caught the water along with the grit. It gave up a clean gallon so slowly that the remuda came in off the drive, parched, and stood pressing and shouldering at the trough while the clean cask filled a thin thread at a time. A crowding remuda is a kicking, biting danger, and one of Noah's horses went down to its knees in the crush before 3 men could haul it clear by the halter. Eli had come running at the noise, and Mara caught him by the collar and set him behind her before he reached the rail, because a boy at a crowding trough is a boy underfoot of 1,000 pounds of frightened horse. Noah took a hoof across the shin, hauling the down horse up, and limped on it a week, and never once said that it hurt, because a man drawing his first full wage does not limp where the trail boss can see him. "Can the boy read your ration marks in the dark?" Abel asked her later, when it had gone quiet. "He'll be issuing water some night when you can't." So she had Eli carve the marks deeper into the issue bucket, a notch he could find with a fingernail and count by feel, and made him prove it blindfold under his own kerchief, and he read them right every time and wrote in the book that he could. Abel timed it against the sun. A single gallon came clean in 14 minutes. "I cleaned it until it could not do its work," Mara said. The fix was to stop asking the cloth to do the cask's work. The standing did most of it, the heavy dirt settling out on its own if given a quarter hour. The cloth had only to catch what floated, so it could be a looser weave, boiled clean but not packed home. Loosened, the same cloth passed a clean gallon in 6 minutes, and the remuda drank in its order, and no horse went down again. Abel timed the new rig, wrote the 6 minutes in his own book beside her 14, and would not give her a verdict on it. "Ask me at Dodge," Abel said, and wiped the pencil. The river work came next, and it was the second time Ross set her straight on ground that was his and not hers. She built the ford line the way it read in her head, a hemp line off the tongue ring to a rider downstream to hold the wagon's nose against the current. The load lifted high before every crossing, the empty casks sealed and lashed under the high side to float that side up if the water ever came over the bed. A spare single tree tied where a hand could reach it without looking, and the children carried across on their own, ahead of the wagon always, never riding it. All of that Ross let stand without a word, but she had drawn the wagon's crossing as the shortest line straight across close behind the herd, and at that he stopped her. "The cattle cross on the slant downstream, letting the current help them over," Ross said. 3,000 head crossing on the slant churns the bottom to soup for 100 feet below their line. You put the wagon straight across right behind them, and you put it into the churn, and a wagon in churned river bottom goes down to the axle and sits there while the water comes up. He crouched and drew it in the dirt with a stick, the slant of the herd, the ruined bottom below the line, and then a clean line for the wagon well downstream where no hoof had been. "You cross where they haven't." "Downstream, then," Mara said, "and I was wrong about the line." She said it plain and did not decorate it. Then she put it to the proof at the next creek, a shallow crossing running clear. The herd went over on the slant and churned the bottom below their line to a brown pudding, exactly as Ross had drawn it in the dirt, and Mara took the wagon well downstream over ground no hoof had touched, and it went through firm and came up the far bank without once dropping to the axle. She had drawn the short line. He had drawn the right one. That was the end of it. Then she strung the last of it, the part meant for the dark. A guide rope run from the wagon to the fire trench, to the remuda post, to the high ground, knotted at arm's length the whole way, so a hand in the black could count its way home along the knots. 2 lanterns shut in pierced tin boxes a wind could not blow out. 3 stakes driven in a triangle for an anchor, deep, and the repair satchel hung on the center line where it could be found without hunting, cinched shut with the wide harness strap stamped T and V, because a strap her husband's own hands had made would hold when a store-bought buckle let go. Abel walked the whole rig before he would let it stand, wiping the pencil, and found 2 more things. What takes the strain if that forward line pulls sideways instead of straight? He said, and put his thumb on the tongue ring. The ring. 1 ring, 1 bolt, and your whole wagon hung off it in a current. He wiped the pencil. Double it. She doubled the tongue ring with a 2nd bolt and a backing plate cut from the spare iron. And when it all goes wrong in the dark, Abel said, and you have to cut that guide rope to free a man, where do you cut it so you don't turn the anchor loose in the same stroke? She had no answer for that one, and said so, and then she found one. She tied a wrap of red flannel to the rope on the wagon side of the last anchor knot, a cut point a knife could find in the black, so that a rope cut there freed the man and left the anchor holding. Abel wrote both changes in his book and still would not give her a verdict. Jude helped her drive the guide rope stakes and mocked every one of them while he swung them all. A rope to find your own camp by, Jude said, and slapped the dust off his hat against his knee. Next you'll rope us each to the wagon of a night like goats to a fence. He drove the stake home clean and tied off the knot at arm's length exactly where she showed him, and mocked it, and set the next one just as true, and tied that knot just as careful, all the while telling her it was foolishness. They trailed north through the last of May with the systems running quiet, and for a stretch of days the book read the way a cook only dreams it will. The count held. The 40 head Abel had marked as too many for the water lived, because the standing casks and the boiled reserve stretched 2 poor holes into water enough, and Ross said nothing about it, and neither did she. But Abel set a small mark beside the number he had once left in the camp like a stone, which from Abel was close to an apology. Eli read the totals out every night in a steady voice. Noah built his fires blind and got them right. Cora's cough eased in the warmer dark. It was the quiet stretch, and Mara had cooked through enough seasons to distrust a quiet stretch and to spend it getting ready instead of resting. The note still came due the 1st of August. Every day the trail 8 was a day gone off the front of it, and south of them the sky was keeping account of its own. A rider came down the trail, while Jude was still laughing at his own stakes, one of Mace Redden's men, with an offer in his mouth for Ross. Mace himself came the next morning to say it to Ross's face. He trimmed his thumbnail with the little knife while he said it, unhurried, as though he were doing a neighbor a turn. He would buy the herd where it stood, every head of it, at a price that would clear most of the note. Not all of it. Enough that Ross could walk away with the north pasture lost and the corridor gone to Mace and the man himself still breathing. Sell them breathing, Mace said, and folded the knife shut. Or let the weather count them. No, Ross said. That was the whole of his answer. Mace looked at him a moment, then mounted and rode north, and did not look sorry, because a man does not look sorry when he believes the weather has taken his side of it. The weather came into it that same afternoon. through Tomas, who read it off the land the way Mara read a wheel and made no mystery of any of it. The southern air was turning cold too fast for the season, he said. The clouds that ought to have burned off after sundown were building back thicker instead. Creek trash was coming down past the crossing, torn grass and broken sticks, out of rain that had not yet fallen on them, which meant it was falling hard somewhere above them, and the cattle would not graze the lowest strip along the water, where the grass ran greenest, and cattle that leave good grass on low ground know something a man's map does not. Sooner than you were counting on, Tomas said. Half a day, maybe more than that. Abel heard it out and stopped being a tallyman and went back to being the wagon master he had been in the army. He ordered the last of it done before full dark, every loose piece of iron down off the shelves and stowed low. The children carried to the high ground with the remuda before the wagon went, not after it. One man taken off the cattle altogether and set to watch nothing but the water and call out its rise by the hour. The anchor stakes tested by hand every hour, sound or not, and every dry thing a body might need. Clothes and cloth and matches, sealed apart from every other dry thing, so that no one leak could take it all at once. They worked until the light was gone, and then worked on by the shielded lanterns, and near the end of it the wind that had run steady out of the south the whole afternoon did the thing none of them wanted it to do. It stopped. The grass quit moving. The wagon fly went slack on its poles. The whole low country fell dead still, still enough to hear the creek muttering to itself away in the dark, and in that stillness the cattle, all of them, 3,000 head bedded across the flat, raised their heads at once and turned them to the south. They did not wait for the rain to tell them it had come. In the last of the still air, they made the camp ready the way Abel had ordered and the way Mara had drawn it, every piece of it a thing a hand could touch in the dark. A marker stake went in at the wagon step, taller than a man, so a body coming back blind would strike it with a hand before a wheel struck the body. The two lanterns went up in their pierced tin boxes on the windward poles, where no gust could reach the flame. The guide rope was walked out, and every knot counted, wagon to fire, trench to remuda, post to high ground, and the wrap of red flannel checked at the cut point where a knife could free a man without freeing the anchor. The firewood was split into measured bundles and stacked under the fly, so no one would have to guess at fuel in the black. And Abel's warning was in her hands as she stacked it, so she cut more bundles than the table called for. The raw cask and the clean cask were carried up and lashed, the dipper tied to the clean cask alone. 2 whole meals were cooked ahead and set by biscuits and beans and salt meat, so the fire could go out and the men still eat. The medical tin came forward under the seat. The dry clothing was sealed apart, each bundle in its own oilcloth. The repair satchel was cinched shut with the wide strap stamped T and V and hung on the center line where a hand would find it. Then Abel set the last of his orders on people instead of things. 1 man to the water, and nothing but the water, to call the marks by the hour, and then, as it climbed, by the quarter. 2 men to the anchor, to test every stake by hand on the turn of each watch. Tomas to the lead string, because the lead string was where a herd decided whether to run. Noah to the ovens and the counts. Ross everywhere. Mara at the wagon, which was the heart of it, because the wagon held the dry, and the dry was the whole difference between a hard night and a buried outfit. Every man was given his one thing, so that when the dark came and took the shouting away, no man would have to be told twice. It was full of small things, and not one of them clever, and that was the whole point of it. Nothing in that camp asked a tired, frightened man to think. The stake was where his hand would be. The rope was where his hand would be. The fuel was in bundles a child could count. She had built every part of it for the worst version of each man. The cold one, the hurt one, the one who could not see, because those were the men the storm would be dealing with, not the dry, clever ones of the afternoon. The cattle were shifted off the low ground and away from the drainage. The remuda was put on a high ground of its own, apart, and the children went up to the high shelf with the horses before the wagon was finished, not after, Cora in her slung cot, and Eli beside her with the book buttoned inside his shirt against his chest. Eli watched Mara hang the lantern and then tie the guide rope to the same stake, and asked her why they needed both. "A light tells you where home is," Mara said. "A rope tells you whether you're still going toward it." She tied off the last knot. "In the dark, a light can be any light. The rope only ever goes one place." The creek gave it away first. Trash came down it before the rain reached them. Whole mats of torn grass and broken cottonwood. Riding water that was already brown and already loud out of a storm that had not yet fallen on their own heads. The man Abel had set to watch called the first mark, while the sky above them was still nothing worse than low and gray. Then, on the 29th of May, the rain came. It came before full dark, which was a mercy, because it let them see the first of it work. The wind drove the water in sheets under the belly of the old wagon body, and the wet climbed the original floorboards the way it always had, plank by plank, dark, rising through gray. It climbed to the underside of the raised slats and stopped there. It had nowhere to go but the open drain corners, and the drain corners took it. Mara crawled under with a lantern and laid her hand flat on the bottom of the nearest flour sack, the way she had made Eli do it a lifetime ago in fair weather, and the sack was dry, all four dry. The rebalanced wagon took the soft ground evenly and settled square and did not lean a hand's width either way. She went down the wagon by feel after that, checking one thing at a time the way a wheelwright walks a wheel before a long grade. The doubled tongue ring, sound. The casks, lashed and full, the clean ones still clean. The medical tin under the seat, dry. The sealed clothing, dry. The flour, dry. Every answer came back the same, and it was a strange thing to stand in a rising storm and have every answer come back yes. She served the meal she had cooked before the storm, and the men ate hot in the rain with their backs to the wind, and it steadied them. Eli made the first storm entry in a hand that hardly shook. No wet flour, no medicine lost, one bundle of wood burned. For a while there was almost an ease in the camp, the ease of men who have braced for a blow, taken the first of it, and found themselves still on their feet. They joked low under the fly. One of them said the petticoat pantry might make a dry cowhand of him yet, and the others laughed, and Mara let them have it, because a frightened crew works worse than an easy one. But she had lived long enough to fear a thing that went well too early, and she kept her own eyes on the creek, where the water was doing something the rain over their heads could not account for. Out in the dark, the waterman called his marks on the hour, and each call came a little higher and a little sooner than the last, until Abel, without a word, told him to call them by the quarter hour instead. That small change in the spacing of one man's voice in the dark told the whole camp more than any speech could have. Eli came to her at the wagon with the book and the lantern. "The water's up 2 marks," Eli said, "but the rain hasn't changed. It's the same rain it was an hour ago." 2 marks, and no more rain to explain them. Mara went to the creek edge with the lantern and looked at what came down it, the grass and the broken timber riding high and fast, and understood that the 2 marks had not fallen on them at all. The water was coming from upstream, from the storm that had thrown its trash out ahead of itself, and it would go on coming whether the rain over their own heads grew or not. A river tells you what happened to somebody upstream an hour ago. It never tells you in time to argue. She did not wait to be able to prove it. Move the dry chest another 18 inches up the bed, Mara said, and the children go higher, off the low shelf, all the way up onto the remuda ground. Ross was standing at the wheel with a lantern, and there was no water near that wheel, none. The ground was wet, but the wheel stood clear, and she watched him look at the dry wheel and start to say so. He did not say it. He turned and gave the order to move the children, and moved the dry chest himself, 18 inches up the bed, and asked her nothing. Ross Calder had built his whole life on not moving a wagon until he could see the reason to move it. He moved this one on her word, in the dark, with the wheel beside him still dry, and he did it without a question and without a second look. And that was a thing that had not happened once on the whole trail before that night. 20 minutes later, the water came up over the low shelf where Cora's cot had hung and stood a hand deep where the child had been sleeping. By then the child was up on the high ground with the horses, dry, and no one spoke of that either. The fly went next. A seam let go across the top of the wagon fly with a sound like a slow tearing of cloth, which is exactly what it was, and the rain came straight down through the rent onto the working starter and the bandaged chest below it. Mara was up on the wheel before Ross had the lantern turned, standing on the hub in the wind with the torn cloth gripped in both fists. Ross put his shoulder under her and braced her legs against his chest and held the lantern up inside the flap of his own coat, out of the wet, so the little light fell on her hands and nowhere else. She drove the heavy sail needle through the doubled oilcloth with the wetting thimble on her thumb, forcing it through where a bare thumb would only have bruised, and the thimble bent under the push, and she kept pushing, and the seam came together crooked and ugly and closed. Her thumb bled where the bent thimble had chewed into it, and she did not feel it until much later. The seam she left would have shamed her in daylight, a drunk, staggering line of big stitches, and it turned the rain, and turning the rain was the only thing she had asked of it. But while she sewed, the working starter crock stood open on the bench below her, and a gust caught the fly and slapped it hard, and the crock went off the bench into the dark and the water, and was gone. She heard it go. She did not stop sewing because the seam was worth more than the crock. When she came down, she opened the lidded coffee tin and found the waxed cloth reserve dry and hard and sound inside it, and it was the only starter left in the world that belonged to that camp. She had carried the living starter 11 years, fed it through good camps and bad, and it was gone in the time it takes a gust to lift a corner of cloth. Lenora's method, dried and folded and shut in a tin, had come down to being the whole of it. She did not mourn the crock out loud. She checked the tin, found it sound, and went on to the next thing, because the night was a line of next things, and grief was not anywhere on the line. The bandaged chest under the tier had taken some wet before she closed the seam, and she carried it forward under the seat, dried what could be dried, and wrote the loss in the book, 2 rolls of bandage soaked through. Everything that night was one more small loss counted, set down, and left behind. Then the lightning came, and it did not strike the wagon. It struck the flat above the bed ground, close, a white crack that lit every falling drop for one long instant and stunned the very air, and 3,000 head of cattle came up off the ground, turning. A rider went down. It was Jude. His horse fell in the churned mud when the herd swung under it and threw him, and when he got to his feet, the whole world was one black roar, and there was a light off across the draw, and he went toward it, because a lost man goes toward a light. It was not the wagon. It was Mace Redden's camp, burning its own lantern on the far side of the rising water, and the draw between the two was filling fast, and Jude was walking straight down into it. His hand found the guide rope in the dark. He never saw it. He walked into it at the waist and grabbed it the way a drowning man grabs, and it was knotted, and the knots told him the one thing a light could not, which was direction. He turned and started back along the rope, knot by knot, counting them aloud because Mara had built the rope to be counted, and the counting held him out of the water. Out along the rope it was two men crawling toward a voice, and the voice counting knots, 19, 18, 17, and the flood loud somewhere below, and rising. Ross went from the wagon end and Tomas from the remuda end, each calling his own count back so Jude would hear he was held between two known things and not lost between two nothings. The knots were an arm's length apart the whole way. Everyone. The spacing Jude himself had driven and laughed at while he drove it, and now he counted his own foolishness back toward the light one knot at a time, and it held him, and he would not say a word against a rope again as long as he lived. When Ross's hand closed on Jude's collar, the boy had gone past shivering into the slow, quiet, dangerous cold that comes after the shivering stops. They hauled him up out of the wet and carried him between them along the rope, knot by knot, back to the one place the rope led. The first thing Mara did for him was the thing that keeps such a man alive, and it was not the fire. She got the wet clothes off him and would not let a soul put him near the flame, because a body chilled that deep and warm too fast dies of the warming. She packed him in the dry sealed blankets and set him between two men for their heat and let him come back the slow way, degree by degree, the long way that hurts and works. It is slow work, and it looks like doing nothing, and a man who does not know better will always want to shove the frozen one at the flames and be done with it. Mara knew better. She had not lost a soul to the cold yet, and she did not mean to start by being merciful too fast. Cora watched from the high ground, watched them all bent over the shaking man, and she pushed her own small wool blanket down off the cot toward him, the blanket she slept under every night, and when they tried to give it back to her, she would not take it. So it stayed on Jude. The blanket was small and did almost nothing against the cold of a grown man, and warmth was not the point of it. She had given the one warm thing she owned to a shaking stranger, and no one had made her, and no one could make her take it back, and the men who saw it did not forget it. Eli had come down off the high ground to be near the working, the way a boy will when the being away is worse than the being near, and Mara did not send him back up. She put the lantern in his hands instead, because a thing to do is the best thing you can hand a frightened child, and he held it steady over the shaking man and did not look away. When Jude could shape words again, the first thing he said through his chattering teeth was that Mace's camp was already taking water. He had seen the far lantern sitting low, too low, with black water climbing the wheels under it. Then Tomas was hurt, and it was worse, because Tomas did not go down for small things. He was turning the lead string away from the broken bank, doing the one thing on earth that kept 3,000 head from pouring themselves into the flood, and a steer through its head, and a horn caught him across the ribs and laid him open along the side. Not the belly. Mara made herself sure of that first, because the belly would have been past anything her hands could do. It was the side, deep and bleeding hard. Venn was somewhere north in the dark on his own road, and might as well have been on the far side of the moon. So Mara did what she had been shown, and what she had done before, and nothing at all that she had not. She flooded the wound with water boiled in the one kettle kept for wounds, and nothing else, and packed it, and bound it hard to stop the bleeding, and stitched what had to be stitched with the gut thread out of the tin that no longer sat buried under 100 pounds of flour. She did not pretend to be a surgeon, and she did not try to become one under a leaking fly at midnight. She worked with Eli holding the lantern steady, and Noah keeping the wound kettle boiling, and Jude, useless in one hand, tearing clean cloth into strips against his own knee. It took every one of them. Tomas made no sound the whole time but once, and when it was bound he tried to sit up and get back to the lead string, and Ross put one flat hand on his chest and held him down, and that was the only order in the whole drive that Tomas ever took lying still. Ross took the lead string himself then, wet through, and passed tired, because it could not be left, and there was no one else to leave it to. Noah split himself between the ovens and the watercalls. Jude worked the book one-handed. For a long stretch of that night, every last person in the outfit was doing a job that was not their own, and doing it well enough to matter, and that was the thing the fair-weather drilling had bought them. Not that nothing broke, that when it broke, there was always a second hand who already knew the count. Cora's cough had come back with the cold, deep, and rattling in her small chest, and now Mara had the two of them to keep, the man and the child, through the worst of it. She settled Cora back down into the slung cot in the driest, warmest corner the wagon had, because it was the only warm, dry place left, and a child with that cough had to be kept warm, and every little while she left the men to the wagon and went to the child and came back, and the going and coming back was its own hard arithmetic, the man against the child against the wagon, 3 lives and 2 hands, and no time to do the sum twice. The systems were not saving anyone by themselves. They were the reason there was anything dry and warm and clean to save anyone with. Noah held the ovens and the Count's blind so there was hot water through all of it. Jude, who could not close a hand on a rope, took the book out of Eli's cold fingers for an hour, and kept the watermarks himself so the boy could hold the lantern for the sewing, and then gave it back, and the boy buttoned it into his shirt again. Then the gray day came, the 30th, and it brought no relief with it, only enough light to see how much water there was. The rain thinned but did not stop. The creek held 8 feet of itself, and would not fall, brown and fast and full of trees, roaring where a day before it had muttered. There was nothing to do in the gray light but hold what they had and stay standing, and staying standing through a day with no fire and no dry warmth and no sleep is a harder thing than a single sharp fright. Men who had joked under the fly the first night went silent on the second day. Ross moved among them and among the cattle and did not let any of them stop, because a man who stops in that cold does not always start again. Mara kept coffee going on the one small sheltered fire she was still allowed, and carried it out to them 1 tin cup at a time, and the second cup she had learned to pour for herself she poured now for whoever needed it worst. Ross and Mara passed each other a dozen times in that gray day, and hardly spoke, because there was nothing to say that the work was not already saying. Once she caught his sleeve as he went by and turned his hand over and looked at it, the knuckles split again and gone white with the cold, and she gave him back his own gloves, the ones he had handed her a month and a lifetime ago on the bank, and this time he took them and put them on and went back out to the cattle. That was the whole of the conversation. The cattle stood the day out in the wet with their heads down and their tails to the wind, 3,000 of them, and now and then one would try to drift toward the low ground out of pure animal misery, and Tomas's riders would turn it back, and the turning back never once stopped in all that gray day, because a herd left to drift in that misery drifts into the water. By afternoon, men were sleeping in the saddle a breath at a time and jerking awake, and Ross rotated them through the one dry corner 2 at a time for a half-hour each and called it rest. It was not rest. It kept them upright, which was all he asked of it. And somewhere in that long gray day, the guide rope began to give. It had rubbed all through the first night against the bare iron corner of the wagon box, where it turned toward the anchor, a saw stroke every time the wind worked the wagon, hour upon hour, and no one had thought to pad that one corner because no one had thought the wagon would move enough to matter. The wagon had moved all night and all day. The outer fibers wore through and stood out in a gray fringe, and then a whole outer strand parted with a sound like a plucked string, and the wagon shifted several inches on the softening ground, and one leg of the anchor triangle began to walk slowly up out of the earth. Mara made a hard call and made it fast. She had the fire drowned. A live fire in a wagon that is starting to move is a barn burning waiting to happen. Loose coals thrown into a canvas world, and she poured the water on it with her own hands and killed the light and the heat both. The cold came into the camp the moment the fire died, a different cold, the wet cold of no hope of getting warm, and the men felt it and said nothing. The sealed emergency meal was opened and eaten cold in the dark, and it was there to be eaten because she had sealed it a month before against exactly this hour. She had lost a fire once before in the squall that shamed her, and had promised herself she would not lose another, and here she was drowning one with her own two hands on purpose. The first fire had gone out because she built it wrong. This one went out because she chose it to save the wagon, with a cold meal already sealed against the choosing, and the whole distance she had come that spring was in the difference between the two. Now it took both of them, and neither one alone. Ross knew how to bleed the pressure off the bank, easing 3,000 frightened head back by voice and by feel, so their weight stopped crowding the softening ground toward the draw. And he went out into the black to do it, and she could not see him do it, and had to trust that he was, the way he had trusted her at the wheel. Mara knew the wagon, and she divided its load off the one failing line onto two shorter lines, run to the two anchor legs that still held, so that no single rope carried the whole wagon again. She moved the strap-stamped T&V from the tool roll to the repair satchel, because the satchel was about to matter more than the tools. The wagon held. It held the way a held breath holds. Eli, back with the book, wrote that the water had risen 5 marks in 17 minutes, and read the number up to her over the wind, and she heard it, and did not answer it, because there was no answer to make. Then the center anchor lifted an inch, and the second night came down on them, and everything the storm had been building toward for a day and a half arrived at once. It was the 30th of May, turning into the 31st the second night. The wind that had run hard the whole time rose now to 52 miles an hour, and the cold fell clean out of the sky, 79 degrees that first afternoon, down to 46, and the creek had put up 8 feet in 2 hours, and there was no ground left at all between the wagon and the herd and the draw, and a body could not see its own hands in front of its face. The upper bank broke away under the right rear wheel. The wagon dropped and tilted toward the flooded draw, and the center anchor, already lifting, tore clean out of the ground, and the whole wagon began to go over, slow, toward the black water. A second stake, one leg of the triangle that was left to them, took the sudden strain and began to walk up out of the softened ground after it. The clean water cask slid on the tilting bed. If it broke free, it would take the dry chest and the slung cot with Cora asleep, and fevered inside it, and the last of everything down into the draw with it. Ross tied a rope around Mara's waist and knotted it fast and put the free end into his own 2 hands. "If I go, pull," Mara said. "Not before." She went out along the lee side of the tilting wagon on her hands and knees, over the wheel and along the down side above the black water, carrying the repair satchel. The old sling on the satchel snapped under its own weight, and the satchel dropped, and the wide strap stamped T&V cinched around it, caught on her wrist, and held it there against her arm above the flood. She kept going. At the water stake set close by the wagon, near enough the rising creek that Ross had twice told him where to run, Eli read the marks off Lenora's headings by the lantern, with the book buttoned inside his shirt, and called each number up over the wind, and Noah caught them and carried them to Ross, so he would know how much ground the night had left them. Tomas held the lead string turned off the broken bank, with his own ribs bound tight against the pull of it, so the cattle did not come down on top of all of it. Jude, who had laughed loudest at the rope, held the lantern box steady with his one good hand, so the little light fell where Mara's hands were, and nowhere it was wasted. And inside the tilting wagon, a hand's reach above the black water, Cora lay in the slung cot too fevered to know how near it had come. She drove a new stake into ground beyond the soft edge, past where the flood had reached, leaning her whole weight on the maul with hands she could no longer feel. The maul came down and glanced and came down again, and every blow went up her dead arms into her shoulders and told her nothing because her hands had stopped reporting to her an hour before. She set the stake by watching it, not by feeling it, and got it deep and made the second line fast to it. That was the whole of the peak of the Black Fork flood. A woman driving a stake she could not feel into ground she could not see, on the wrong side of a wagon that was trying to go into a flood, and a man on the other end of a rope waiting. Ross began to transfer the wagon's weight onto the new line. The rope came tight. The wheel dropped another inch, and the wagon groaned, and Mara was still out over the water on the wrong side of it with her fingers gone dead and useless, and Ross had the rope at her waist and every reason in the world to haul her in. He did not pull. He waited because she had told him to wait, and he trusted the telling over the sight of her out there in the dark, and that trust was the last thing they had built and the one that had taken the longest to build. The second line took the weight. The stake beyond the soft ground held. The wagon stopped moving. Mara came back along the lee side and over the wheel to the high side and lay there in the wind, and Eli's voice came down to say the water had reached the last mark and stopped rising. "The line has given us until morning," Ross said. "Morning is enough," Mara said. The rain went on, and the wind went on, and the cold went on, and there was nothing left to build and nothing left to move, only the holding and the waiting. Sometime in the dead middle of it, Mara cut open one sealed sack of flour, the nearest one, and put her whole hand into the center of it, and the center was dry, bone dry, in the middle of a drowning world. She let the men see it, because they needed to see one dry thing before the light came. But it was one sack. 30 more sat sealed and unopened in the dark, and one dry handful told her about one handful and told her nothing at all about the 30. It told her nothing about the count of the cattle still out in the black water, or the note that came due in Kansas the 1st of August, or whether the second line would hold as long as the morning was long. So they held the wagon, and they warmed the man and the child who were hurt, and they waited for the light to tell them what the water had done. The water fell on the 4th morning, and there was no cheering when it did, because the light showed them what the dark had been hiding. The creek dropped almost as fast as it had risen, sucking back down its banks and leaving a brown ruin of mud and stranded timber, and the drowned grass laid all one way. The wagon stood where the second line had held it, tilted and mired to the hub but upright, and Cora slept on in the slung cot with her fever broken in the night, and Tomas breathed slow and even against his bound ribs, and Jude sat with his wrist in a sling and his eyes open. They had all of them lived. Nobody said so out loud because saying so felt like tempting the count that was still to come. Mara did the thing she had learned to do before she let herself do anything else. She had Eli open the book to a clean page under Lenora's old heading, the one that said cause, and she named every weakness the flood had found, and the boy wrote each one down in his careful hand. The fire shield built too tight, the reserve crock chosen for the look of it. The Dutch oven overfired in the rain, the water filter packed until it could not work. The guide rope left to saw against bare iron, the first anchor set in ground that only looked firm, a spare packet of dry clothing stowed too low and soaked, the working starter kept too near the opening and lost. Mace's warning taken as a trick when it might have been a fact, and the wagon left on the low ground an hour longer than it should have been. 10 of them, written out plain, and not one excuse set down beside any. A thing that lived. Mara said, should not be let to hide what nearly killed it. She had Eli read the 10 of them back aloud, the way he read the day's totals, and the men who had lived through everyone listened and did not flinch and did not argue. That reading was its own kind of ledger, an outfit hearing its own weak places counted out and owning them, and it steadied the crew more than any thanks for surviving could have. Then they counted, and only then, because a number you are afraid of is still a number and had better be looked at square. They opened the bins in the daylight and cut samples from the worst places, the low corners and the outer inches where the water would have gone first. 2 flour sacks had taken wet along the outermost inch and were ruined for keeping, though the hearts of them were sound. 1 sack of salt had dissolved from the bottom into brine. The working starter was gone, and the coffee had run down below the margin Mara liked to keep. But the medicine was whole, every roll and every packet dry in its tin. The beans were sound. The emergency meal had been there when they needed it, and no man in the outfit was down from spoiled food or foul water, not one, in a week that had drowned 2 herds they passed on the way to Kansas. They cut the samples from the low corners and held them to the light, the ruined outer inch and the sound heart of each sack both, and wrote down everyone, so that what was lost and what was saved sat side by side in the same hand, and neither could hide the other. The cattle were the harder count, and it took 6 days on the recovered ground to make it honestly. 27 had drowned or been hurt past saving in the night. 58 had scattered into the dark and the water. Of those they got 36 back over the following days, riding the draws and the far banks, and 22 they never found, and Mara would not let the book pretend otherwise. The 6 days of the recovery were their own hard work, the crew strung out along the drying draws and the far banks, hauling stranded cattle out of the mud where the water had dropped them, and turning back the ones that could still walk. Tomas rode it with his ribs strapped, against Mara's telling him not to, and Noah found 9 head alone in a side canyon, and drove them home, tapping his boot heel once at each. Every head that came back went into the book under recovered, and every head that did not went under lost, and the 2 columns were kept as honest as the good one, because a count that flatters you is worse than no count at all. Then the ordinary trail took its ordinary due the rest of the way to Dodge, another 77 head to lameness and heat, and the 100 small deaths of a long drive. When the tally at Dodge City was finally closed, it read 2,914 head delivered in sound, saleable condition. The note called for 2,880. Ross looked at the 2 numbers a long while, the one they owed and the one they had, and he did not make a speech because 34 head is not a speech. He took the pencil and circled the 2 of them, the way a man circles a thing he means to remember, and put the pencil down. He did not tell the crew what the margin was, not that day. He wrote the 2 numbers at the head of the page with the space between them, and let the space be the size it was. 34 head, the whole of the ranch and the horses, and the winter wages balanced on the width of it. He did not celebrate a margin that thin. He circled it, and he remembered how near the other side of the line had been. The tallyman read the whole of it before he would say a word, and Abel Mercer read everything, the good numbers and the drowned ones, and the 10 weaknesses written under cause with no excuse beside them. He wiped the pencil and turned back through the storm pages, the watermarks, and the coal counts, and the losses named plain, and when he was done he closed the book and gave his verdict to Ross, low, the 2 of them standing at the tailgate. The system did not make the storm any smaller, Abel said. It kept each mistake from borrowing the next one. That's the whole of what it did, and it's everything. Later, when he stood before the lender's men to say whether the note should be counted paid, he said it plainer still and let it stand in the record. She did not prevent the weather, Abel said. She prevented 1 failure from becoming 5. The lender's men had come to Dodge half expecting to foreclose, because a man who owes $6,400 against a flooded drive is usually a man who owes it still. Abel laid the book in front of them instead, the watermarks and the losses, and the 10 weaknesses, and the delivery count, and read them the two numbers, the one owed and the one made, and let the 34 head between them do the talking. They marked the note paid. Abel wiped the pencil, closed the book, and handed it back to the boy whose hand had kept it, and told Eli it was the cleanest set of trail books he had read in 30 years, which from Abel was very near a blessing. Jude never said any such thing, because Jude did not have the words in him for it, and never would. But when the outfit broke up at Dodge and the men drew their wages, Mara found under the wagon seat where the tools rode a new coil of good hemp rope and 3 chafe guards of stiff leather cut to fit an iron corner, left there by a man with a mending wrist who had once asked whether they were driving cattle or opening a boarding house. There was no note with them. Jude was already gone. He had left the one apology he knew how to make, which was a thing that would keep a rope from wearing through against bare iron in the dark. Mace Redden came last, because Mace always came last, and he came having lost more than any of them. He had camped his outfit in a shallow drainage that first night, because the low banks seemed to break the wind, and the runoff had come in behind him and stood on the boards where his flour and his medicine sat flat, and he had lost his stores and 31 more head than Ross had, and there was no arguing his way out of a number like that. He came to the mired wagon at Dodge the way a man comes to a thing he has decided to stop being wrong about. He did not soften toward her, and he did not warm. That was not in him. He cut a sample of dry flour out of a sack that had ridden through the same flood that ruined his own, and rolled it between his fingers, and looked at it a long moment and set it down. He did not apologize for the petticoat pantry. He walked the length of the mired chuck wagon instead, trimming his thumbnail with the little knife, and looked at the raised floor and the drain corners and the doubled tongue ring, and then he closed the knife and asked the only question that mattered to him. How much air did you leave under the sacks? Mara named him a price for the whole of it, the drawing and the written order of the work, the fixes and the reasons under the fixes. $25. She did not soften it, and she did not talk herself down when he let the silence sit there, which was a trader's trick, and she had grown up among traders. Mace paid the $25 and took the drawing, and that was the nearest thing to an apology he had in him, and both of them knew it counted as one. She was in the business of the thing by nightfall, whether she had meant to be or not. Ruth Penrose found her first. Ruth the freight widow who worked with harness nails between her lips. And Ruth did not want the storm plan. She wanted the wagon. She hauled meal and medicine between the Texas settlements over roads that flooded every spring, and she had watched Blackwater Fold's flour come into Dodge dry out of a drowning, and she wanted a freight wagon built the same way. So Mara taught her the raised dry floor, the open drain corners, the balanced load, the separate clean water tools, the chafe guards on every corner a rope might touch. She charged Ruth $25 for the plan and $5 to see it fitted to a freight bed, and $1 more if Ruth wanted her name struck off the drawing, and Ruth, who had buried a husband for lending things for thanks, would no more strike a builder's name off her own work than cut the maker's mark from a good harness. Nobody ever chose the extra dollar. And Mace wanted the storm procedure for his next drive north, which was a different thing from the wagon, and Mara taught him different. She taught him what could be copied straight across and what could never be, and she said the one thing to him she would end up saying to every man who came after. You can copy the boards, Mara said. You still have to understand where the water wants to go. The fire shield could not simply be built to a drawing, she told him, because the wind ran a different road on every ground, and the smoke had to be given somewhere to leave. The anchor was not about the shape of the stakes, but about the firmness of the dirt under them, which a man had to test with his own hands and not take on faith. The wagon had to be balanced to its own load, and the crossing chosen for its own river. What a man could take away on paper was the order of the work and the reasons under it. What he had to bring himself was the reading of his own ground. Mace listened to all of it, which was more than the Mace of April would have done, and paid what she asked and did not haggle. By the time the outfit scattered from Dodge, 3 more trail bosses had come to the wagon to ask their own version of Mace's question, and Mara had a price for each and a drawing for each, and Eli had begun a second book, a thin one, that listed who had bought the plan and what ground they meant to run it on, so that when one of them built it wrong, she would know where to look. The system had stopped being one wagon's luck. It had become a thing that could be taught, and a thing that could be taught could be sold, and a widow with 2 children and a 1/8 share had learned exactly what that difference was worth. Then the season she had bargained for came to its end, in Dodge City, on the day the last of the herd was sold, and the note was carried to the men who held it and marked paid. The bargain had been for the trail and no more. Mara loaded the wagon to leave, her tool roll bound in the strap stamped T&V, Cora's cot, the coffee tin with the reserve in it, Eli's book, her wages, and the $10 premium counted out and folded away. She meant to cook at a Dodge boarding house until she had put by enough to carry the children east, back toward whatever East had left for them, which was not much. She had the wagon half loaded before Ross came down from the sail pens, the tool roll cinched in the strap, and Cora's cot folded, and the coffee tin with the last of the reserves set on top where it would not be crushed. Eli stood by the tailgate with his book under his arm and did not ask where they were going, because he had learned not to ask a thing he was afraid to hear the answer to, and that not asking was the loudest sound in the yard. She did not ask Ross for anything, because asking had never been the shape of the thing between them. Ross did not ask her to stay. He was not a man who could have made that speech, and both of them knew it. Instead, he wrote something out, slow, in his own square hand at the tailgate, and when it was done, he put the paper on the wagon seat where she would find it, and walked off a little way to let her read it alone. It was not a proposal. It was terms. That Eli and Cora would have a home at Blackwater Fold for 5 years, come what might between the 2 grown people, and that this held whether Mara ever spoke a soft word to him or never did. That she would take a 1/8 share of the outfit's net for the work she did. That her tools stayed her own. That the wagon system could not be sold or licensed to any man without her name on the paper and her hand to it. That she would draw $60 a month for the stores and the camp. That no herd could be grown past what she could provision without her signature beside his. And that the north pasture, the ground the whole note had ridden on, could not be sold out from under her without she was first offered the buying of her earned share of it. It was a paper about children and property and a woman's name kept on her own work, and there was not one soft word anywhere in it, and that was the whole reason it could be trusted, because a bad winter could not revoke it, and a change of feeling could not either. Mara read it twice. Then she looked up. "You're giving me a share of your own ground," Mara said. "I'm not giving you what was mine," Ross said. "I'm naming what you already carried." Abel Mercer signed it as a witness, and Ruth Penrose signed it below him with a harness nail still between her lips, and that made it a real thing before it was ever a soft one. Later, back at Blackwater Fold, with the wagon unloaded and the children asleep, Ross stood by the stove and did not look at her. "Stay through the fall roundup," Ross said. Mara looked at the small, unfinished chair of ashwood, standing now in the corner of the house it had been made for, its seat still open to the frame. "Longer than that," Mara said. No kiss came after the line. Ross set out a second cup by the stove the next morning, the way he had learned to again on the trail, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The thing they had built came back on them in the fall, the way a true thing will, and it came wearing their own shape. It was late in September when Ruth Penrose's new freight wagon came up the road toward Blackwater Fold with meal and medicine, and it came smoking. Ruth had built it off Mara's plan, the raised floor and the rain skirt, but she had hired the building out, and the carpenter had copied what he could see and misjudged what he could not. He had looked at the 3-inch airspace under the false floor and thought it waste, and he had packed it full of cut grass to cushion the flour and hold the warmth off the road. And he had loaded the grass damp after an autumn shower, and damp grass shut up tight with no air does the one thing damp grass does, which is heat from the inside until it smolders. The young driver smelled it and thought an axle had run hot, and did the worst thing a man can do to a smolder, which is to give it what it wants. He poured water at the wheel to cool the axle, and the water hit the hot grass and turned to steam, and the steam drove the smoke up through the floor into the load, and the horses smelled fire and went half mad in the traces. And the wagon stood at the foot of a dry grass slope that ran straight up to Blackwater Fold's hay sheds, where the winter feed was stacked, and beside the sheds the work shed where the ashwood chair was kept, and inside the house the ledger chest where the paper with Mara's name on it was locked. It was the driest September in years. The grass on that slope was cured to tinder, and a spark in it would not stop at the hay sheds. It would take the sheds and the work shed and the winter feed for 300 head, and with any wind behind it, the house that stood beyond. Everyone who came running understood that in the first breath, which was why the first instinct was speed, and why speed was the wrong one. Ross came out at a run and did the sensible thing, which was to shout for the horses to be cut loose first. "Leave the horses a breath," Mara said. "Look at the smoke." The smoke was not coming from one wheel the way a hot axle smokes. It was seeping up even all along the bottom hem of the skirt, the whole length of it, which is not a wheel and is not an axle. And Mara knew in her stomach what it was because she had built the thing it was pretending to be. "If you open the rear chest to get the flour out, you'll feed it the air it's starving for," Mara said. "And then it's a fire and not a smolder. We open it my way or we don't open it." Ross had every reason of speed to overrule her, and a wagon smoking at the foot of his hay in a dry September is a reason. He stopped anyway, without asking her to prove it, the way he had stopped in the dark at the wheel that would not wet, because they were long past the season of proving things to each other. It had cost him something, that first time on the flooded trail, to move a wagon on her word against his own eyes. It cost him nothing now. That was what a year had built between them, that a thing which had once needed a demonstration now needed only a sentence. "What do you need first?" Ross said. "Bare ground in 6 minutes," Mara said. He gave her both. He put a long line on the panic team and pulled the whole wagon forward, off the base of the slope, onto ground where the grass was already grazed to dirt, so that if it did break into flame, it would have nothing to run to. Mace Redden came over the rise then with 3 of his hands and a plow team, the same Mace who had paid $25 for the drawing, and he did not stand and watch, and he did not make a speech about it. He set his plow to the foot of the slope and turned a bare strip of earth across it, a fire break between the smoking wagon and the winter hay, because he had paid to learn where the water wanted to go, and he knew a smolder when he smelled one. He worked the plow himself and said next to nothing, and when the break was cut, he set his hands along it with shovels in case a spark should jump it, and he did not once remark that the wagon smoking at the foot of the slope had been built off a plan he had watched a widow sell. A year before he would have made a great deal of that. Now he plowed the break and held the line and let the work be the whole of what he had to say. Mara cut 2 low openings in the side of the wagon, small and near the floor, not the whole chest thrown wide, and through them she and Ruth and Jude drew the flour sacks out from the top without ever giving the smolder a free draught of air. Then she pulled the damp grass out in small handfuls and spread it thin on the bare turned ground, where the heat in it had nothing left to build on and nothing to catch, and it steamed itself cool and dead in the open. It was slow, deliberate work in the middle of a thing that looked like an emergency, and that was the hardest part of it, holding to 6 careful minutes while a dry slope and a winter's hay stood a plow width away. But the fire break kept the fear at arm's length, and the small openings starved the smolder instead of feeding it. And one handful at a time, the danger came apart into a thin gray steam that blew off across the grazed dirt and was gone. Dr. Wren, who happened to be on that road as he had a way of being, folded his spectacles into his pocket and saw to Ruth's young driver, who had breathed too much of the smoke and would be hoarse a week, but no worse. And through all of it, Eli did a thing no one had told him to do. When the first smoke showed and the grown people ran for the wagon, the boy went the other way, into the house, and took the ledger chest with the share paper in it out to the middle of the bare yard where no fire could reach it, and set it down, and then took out his own book and began to write. The time the smoke first showed, what was pulled from the wagon and where it was spread, the heat of the floorboards judged by a hand laid on and taken quickly off, and the exact way the floor would have to be built over. He had made himself the keeper of what mattered without being asked, because a boy who has learned that the count is the thing does not wait to be told to keep it. When it was over and the wagon safe, Ross found the ledger chest sitting square in the middle of the bare yard where the boy had dragged it, the share paper dry inside. And he said nothing to Eli about that either, but that night he moved the chest to a shelf the boy could reach, which was his way of saying the keeping of it was the boy's now. When it was cold and safe, they rebuilt the freight floor the way it should have been built the first time. The open 3 inches with nothing packed in it, a board that lifted out so a hand could reach in and feel for heat, metal plates on the corners, the rope crossed, no grass and no cushion, and nothing that could hold damp, and the drain corners cut and marked so plain no carpenter could mistake them for waste again. Mara wrote the whole of the rebuild into the freight book and into her own, the fault and the fix and the reason under the fix, and had a fresh drawing made with the air space marked in red, and a plain line of words set beside it that even a hurried man could not misread. Leave this space empty. It is not waste. Ruth lost 2 sacks of flour and 1 length of oilcloth and the whole of the false floor, and no one was killed, and the hay shed stood, and it was over in an afternoon. It had been a smaller and a quieter thing than the flood. It had also been the truer test, because the flood had tested the system, and this had tested the 2 of them, and they had passed it the new way, in 6 words, and a plow, and a boy who kept the book. The rest of that fall was quiet, and the quiet was the reward. Eli finished the little ashwood chair. He fitted the last of the seat and drove the final peg, working slow with Thomas's tools out of the strap-bound roll, and when it was done, he stood it up and looked at it a long time before he asked the only question he had about it. "Does it stay in this house now?" Eli said. Ross did not answer with words. He picked the chair up and carried it to the table and set it in the place a small chair goes, and steadied it while the boy drove the peg home tight. And that was his answer. The chair had been begun for a child that was never born, and had hung unfinished in a dark shed 3 winters because Ross could neither finish it nor burn it. And now a boy who had come up that road half-starved had finished it with a dead wheelwright's tools and set it at the table of a house that had gone quiet and was not quiet anymore. No one said any of that out loud. The chair said it. Cora walked that fall too. She let go of the leg of the table and crossed the kitchen floor on her own for the first time. 3 steps, and then 4, from Mara's hands to Ross's. And when she got to him, she took hold of his knee and looked up and gave him the name she had been saving. Pa, Cora said. Ross did not make anything of it, because making anything of it would have broken it. He picked her up. Weeks later, when Ross told Eli where to store the mended tally stick for the winter, the boy said, "Yes, Pa," without any weight on it at all, the way a thing is said when it has been true for a while already. Cora took to calling him Pa for everything after that, for his coat and his boots, and the horse she was not let near, wearing the word out and making it ordinary, which was the best thing that could have happened to it. 4 cups stood by the stove after that, 2 large and 2 small, drying side by side. Mace Redden sent up a brass floor vent for the new freight wagon and did not come to the wedding, which was his way of coming to it. Abel Mercer signed the partnership paper over again where the smoke had darkened its edge. Ruth brought flour, not to pay back what she had lost, but because Mara's kitchen was feeding the people who witnessed it. Ross and Mara married quietly when the fall roundup was in, with those few for witnesses, and the paper with the 7 terms stayed exactly as it was written in force and unchanged after the vows as before them, because the children had come first and would go on coming first, and that was the shape of the thing between them and always had been. The Black Fork flood showed no mercy. It found the pretty crock and the hard-packed cloth, the rope left against bare iron, and the stake driven into ground that only looked firm. It found the fire built too tight, and the wagon left too long on the low ground. It found every weakness they had, one after another, exactly as a flood will, because water finds everything. It simply failed to find any single one of them carrying the whole weight alone. That was the whole of what they had built in the end, and it was everything. Not a wall the water could not breach, for there is no such wall. A place where no one failure had to be the last one. On a winter morning at Blackwater Fold, the frost stood white on the yard and the stove was warm. Thomas's wide strap stamped T and V hung on its peg beside Ross's saddle. Lenora's brass measure with the notch, filed at 12 cups, sat beside the coffee tin. The bent thimble lay in the medical box where it had always gone. Eli's finished chair stood at the table. 4 cups waited by the stove, 2 large and 2 small. And out in the cold, before the light was full up, Ross went to the wagon and laid the back of his hand to the left hub, the way she had taught him, and Mara came out and checked the right, the way her husband had taught her, and neither of them said a word because the wagon was sound, and the morning was theirs, and there was nothing that needed saying,